About 130 years ago, the British capital, London, was terrorized by a notorious serial killer called Jack the Ripper. The man who killed a number of women within a few months marked the beginning of the phenomenon of serial killing known now, because he committed his crimes in a horrific manner and with complete devoid of emotion. In the years that followed, many tried to identify Jack the Ripper, but they failed, and for this reason, the movie Jack the Ripper, appealing the case, which presented to the documentary all the modern techniques that forensic science had come up with in the 21st century, was used to try to close this long-standing case. We go back to the year 1888, specifically to the period between August and November of that year, when the Whitechapel area in London witnessed a series of crimes that claimed the lives of 5 women. Despite the passage of all these years, experts have not reached the true number of victims of Jack the Ripper. But most of them agreed that the 5 women were the victims of this serial killer and called them the main 5. Many stories and news were published in British newspapers at the time about what happened in Whitechapel. Investigations were conducted and massive and extensive searches were launched to arrest the killer, but all these attempts failed. Regarding these crimes, forensic scientist Professor David Wilson says, "Through the cases that I studied or worked on, there was a pattern of serial crimes. This pattern provides investigators with several clues indicating the identity of the perpetrator, but finding new evidence will not be easy because many of the original locations, the area where the crimes took place, no longer exists, but the investigation team was able to obtain medical reports containing detailed information about the murders. That is why the team asked one of the best forensic doctors in Britain to help determine how the serial killer's methods and violence against his victims developed." Expressive violence. Secrets of the Digital Autopsy Table. Dr. Jason Payne James, a forensic pathologist, says while standing near a digital autopsy table, this table is an amazing educational tool. For example, when trying to explain the injuries suffered by a victim in any crime before the court, this table enables us, through special slides, to explain the structural map of the body and the composition of its members. Wilson explains that the serial killer was adopting an excessive method of killing because he used excessive brutality to finish off his victims. Killing the victim was only the beginning, as the killer wanted to achieve other goals by killing his first victim, Polly Nichols. Wilson says, "In this crime, there were controlled and organized elements and others that were not. The organized elements were like cutting the throat to prevent the victim from calling for help. The other thing is that the killer used both automatic and expressive violence. The first means killing a specific person and leaving him, but the serial killer used excessive violence to kill his victim. That is, we have entered the scope of expressive violence, and this is what created confusion for me because the serial killer's actions are highly unusual." Criminal autopsy traces the killer's steps at the crime scene. Wilson adopts a new crime detection technique called criminal autopsy, which requires walking through the crime scene and following the steps of the killer. Since the original crime sites have disappeared, it is necessary to rebuild and design the scene of the second crime, in which Annie Chapman was the victim, and seek the help of professional investigators to help unravel the mystery. One of these investigators is Peter Blakesley, who visited the crime scene designed to provide a modern analysis of the crime scene, and he says about the serial killer, "The crime scene blatantly tells us about the horrific mentality of this serial killer and his behavior. He followed a high-risk strategy to carry out his crime in such a place that has one entrance and exit, and the possibility of a large number of residents of the two buildings overlooking the crime scene noticing what is happening there is very high, and the possibility of the residents of the two buildings watching him leaving with his clothes stained with the victim's blood is also great. Through the forensic autopsy, Wilson was able to reach a preliminary conclusion that the killer lives nearby and knows the area like he knows the palm of his hand. Satisfying sexual desire, a double crime at the same time. After the murder of Chapman, the serial killer committed a double crime that claimed the lives of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. He killed them about an hour apart, in two areas separated by 1.5 kilometers. Therefore, the timing and geography of the area are in themselves considered important evidence, because they indicate that the killer he knows the area in detail. Wilson says, the serial killer killed Stride, but he was unable to mutilate her body after a person appeared riding in a horse-drawn carriage. Therefore, the serial killer felt sexually frustrated, which prompted him to quickly leave the place in search of another victim, and he found what he was looking for in Catherine Eddowes. At that time, two people saw the serial killer in the two areas where the two crimes took place, and they gave almost the same description, but they differed in clothing. This is what Wilson explains by saying, the serial killer went to his house and changed his clothes. The double crime gives indications that the man is not only interested in killing, because the killing of Elizabeth Stride was not enough for him, as there are two types of dead people, one of them is interested in killing, and the other focuses on the details of the operation. If the serial killer Jack had been one of the criminals who focused only on killing, he would have been satisfied with killing the first victim and returning home. But what confirms that he is of the second type is he mutilated the body of the second victim, Eddowes, and this is linked to his hatred of women, his sexual needs, and his failure to satisfy his desires by killing Stride. Mary Jane, a victim behind closed doors. In the double crime, the serial killer cut off the neck of Elizabeth Stride, mutilated the body of Catherine, mutilated her face, and removed the internal abdominal organs. This indicates that the violence of the serial killer increases with every crime he commits, reaching an unprecedented level and peaking with Mary Jane Kelly, his fifth victim. Mary Jane was the only victim who was not killed in the street or in a square, but rather behind doors and in her room, as the serial killer had the space and time necessary to realize his darkest fantasies and satisfy his abnormal desires. According to the criminal autopsy carried out by David Wilson and Peter Blakesley, the serial killer was giving a deceptive impression and making the women feel comfortable, and that is why there was no chaos in the room. The victim's clothes were not scattered, and there were no signs of dislocation or breakage of the room, and it is clear that the killer carried out his crime comfortably and was not in a hurry to leave the place, according to Professor Wilson. Wilson explained, the most shocking thing about Mary Jane's crime is the brutality that the serial killer inflicted on her face. According to the forensic doctor's report at the time, Mary Jane's face was crushed and severely injured in all directions, and her nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears were torn from their places. This crime was not a murder, but rather a horrific total mutilation. Wilson summarizes the serial killer's personality and mental state after this crime by saying, he hated women intensely, so when he had enough time to seize the body of a dead woman, he deliberately mutilated it, obliterated her human features, and dismembered her. There are elements at the crime scene that indicate a state of abnormal sexual lust. It is a state of sexual passion in which the killer reaches his state of sexual climax by beating and stabbing his victims. Holmes technology, linking links between crimes. After the accumulation of data and analysis on the case, which dates back more than 130 years, it was necessary to use a new system used in Britain to detect major crimes, which is the HOMS technology, the main inquiry system of the main Bureau of Investigation, for forensic analysis, which is the first time that it has been used. This system explores the crimes of Jack the Ripper. The Holmes system linked all available information about the 5 basic crimes to all crimes committed in that period, and found links between them. The system concluded that the 5 crimes committed by Jack the Ripper were similar to the murder of a woman named Martha Tabram, which was never added. The serial killer's crimes list, even though she is his first victim, and the last crime helps the team to find out where the killer lived. Wilson says that we must resort to the geographic prediction method, which is simply based on predicting the killer's place of residence through the places where he committed his crimes. Narrowing the geographical scope, interrogating the killing sites. The film uses one of the best geographical forecasters in Britain, Dr. Sam Londrigan, who worked with the police in uncovering several crimes. She explained the difference between movers and raiders. She says, these 2 types are distinct, but they give an idea of the relationship between the place where the aggressor lives and the place where he lives, in which he commits his crimes. The mover's place of residence is far from the one where he commits his crimes, while the raider is the one whose place of residence is within the area in which he commits his crimes. She explains that 85% of serial killers are usually raiders. Wilson intervenes to say, it is clear that Jack the Ripper is a type of raider and lives in the Whitechapel area or on its borders. This was agreed upon by Dr. Londrigan, who said, I am trying to narrow down the geographical scope in which the killer moved, because when he commits his first crime, he does not know what the next step is, and his lack of experience and self-confidence makes him attached to his place of residence as a safe haven that he can resort to after carrying out his crime. Geographic forecasting is a technique that matches witness testimony. In conclusion, the geographical prediction indicates that the Ripper lived in the Whitechapel area or on the border adjacent to the scene of the crime of Martha Tabram, who was considered the first victim of Jack the Ripper, and this was the key to solving the mystery. Regarding this conclusion, Wilson confirms that the killer is well acquainted with the Whitechapel area, and this helps us exclude a group of suspects at that time. After refuting the reasons why these suspects did not commit crimes, Wilson found a new suspect whose name had not been mentioned previously, and who lives in Whitechapel. He is a very ordinary person, to the point that he is far from suspicion, but this person is known for his violent tendency, and all the criteria for our case apply to him. The mysterious man, named Aaron Kosminski, and all the descriptions revealed by the 2 eyewitnesses apply to Kosminski. Aaron Kosminski immigrated to Britain with his family in 1881 and settled in the Whitechapel area. He lived with his brother, who was his guardian, and his sister, who lived with them in the same house. Medical records indicate that Kosminski suffered from mental problems in 1885, and became suspicious and raving loudly. He claimed that these voices were telling him to act violently. But what attracted the police to him? Wilson says, the police began extensive investigations and knocked on the doors of homes to search for any evidence of the perpetrators of the Mary Jane crime. During these investigations, they reached the Kosminski family, met Aaron and monitored him informally, and this monitoring prevented him from continuing his crimes. But that was not the end, as his family placed him in a home for the mentally ill in 1890 after he attacked his sister with a knife, and since then he has moved between homes for the mentally ill. The man who is considered the most notorious serial killer in Britain and the most famous of all died after suffering from gangrene in 1919, that is, 31 years after he committed the crimes of what was known as Jack the Ripper.